So you mentioned that you've when I talked to you before, you mentioned that you've recently, or I think recently, like reintroduced your dad to uh, psychedelics. And why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Right. Reintroduced is a loose way to put it. He was a deadhead growing up. He would follow the band around, and he enjoyed that. And he always talks positively of it. He's got all these nostalgia. You can see him like zone out and remember and just smile and enjoy it. And he took a break from it after he got started with his career, understandably so. But when he learned that I had tried mushrooms the first time, he had started talking about the trips he had where he saw like spheres of light floating over the audience at like Pink Floyd concerts and stuff. And just giant bags of mushrooms, just classic late 19, I'm not even sure what year it was. But he found out I did psychedelics and he was curious about it. And he was like, hey, do you think maybe I could try some? And he ended up tripping on his own, and he ended up tripping with a girlfriend to help, I guess, butter up their connection or something. And I never had the opportunity to trip with him because my life took a concerning turn through a point of my psychonaut journey, psychonaut career at this point. And he didn't want to lead to more problems, so that got postponed indefinitely. But I've had the opportunity to smoke weed with him and enjoy sharing our stories and talking about the concepts. And he's not totally closed to the idea of it, but it's definitely a thing he's worried about for me.
Mm-hmm. Just because he's worried about the safety of the drugs and stuff.
Well, it putting it out there, the amount of LSD I've used has put me in the hospital on numerous occasions, and it has affected my mental health just because of how irresponsible I was with it.
Oh, okay.
And understandably, he doesn't see it in the best of light from where he's at right now.
Yeah, yeah, I could see that.
If you don't mind me asking, what size, like, are you saying dose wise it was unhealthy, or like frequency?
A bit of both.
Oh,
So
okay.
after I had started hormones, I was on them for about 2 months, and I had a trip on about 150 micrograms of LSD with a friend of mine. He was from college, and we were tripping at his house in a quaint little neighborhood that had an elementary school in it. It was very suburban. It was very pleasant, I guess. And at the start of the trip, we'd taken the tabs and smoked some weed to get our pre-flight jitters out of the way. We laid down and listened to some music for the come up, and it felt like there was an entity or presence sequencing my body. It was going through like a bunch of pre-flight checks for like checking all my muscles and the ranges of motion that my limbs had. It felt completely autonomous, like I wasn't trying to do any of it, and it was following a very particular pattern as it was building itself. And I was laying down, and I ended up sitting up, slowly checking more ranges of motion in different sort of positions. I ended up standing. By this point, my friend was already outside. The music was off. And it eventually got to a point where I got the okay to go, and I was able to walk. And I went through all the safety checks, and I took that first step. And I ended up outside, and we explored a little bit. And as we were walking down the sidewalk towards the school, there was a buzz in the air, You ever get those sort of like tinglies when you're hearing an emotional song or something? And it's those chills, that frisson. It was like walking into like a membrane where that was just happening everywhere, constantly. Is this weird force field of just fuzz on all my touch. And it smelled like butterscotch and orange sherbet. And we walked up on this hill and sat at the base of a tree and just took in the nature, because it was a very, I guess, decorated with plants area. It was a very nice nature area. And the air was a bit humid, and it was the perfect summer afternoon. I guess it was spring still. And we sat at the tree, and the bugs started crawling on us, so I figured we lost our spot there. It was already taken. And as we walked down the hill back onto the sidewalk, there was a cloud on the ground of this yellow mist that was like glowing inside of itself. And as we walked through it, I got more of that fuzz where I touched it. And we could move it around, and there was turbulence when you walked through it, and you could scoop it up, and it was a fully physics responding fluid that was somehow in my trip. Eventually, I decided I wanted to investigate it more, as I do. And I scooped some up in my hand. And I told my friend, hey, hold out your hands in a cup. And he did. And I poured it into his hands, and he was holding it. And I'm like, are you seeing this stuff? He's like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But he was interacting with it. There were other people interacting with it. There were just people from the neighborhood on a walk. And I could see different glowing colors around people that sort of tied in with my synesthesia and auras, I guess, as people describe them. And when I held this stuff in my hands and looked at my hands through it, they appeared aged. And especially my friend's hands. His aged even more than mine did. And for some reason, I decided I wanted to compress this stuff like a snowball. And it did. It definitely compressed. And as it did, that light that it glowed inside of itself focused to a single point, and it was a pin of light shining like a star, or like a headlight if you have astigmatism or something. And I could hold it in my fingers, and it was this glowing pin of light with a halo around it. And I looked at my hand through it, and it was like a lens, and my hand on the other side wasn't my hand, it was a baby's hand. And my friend's hand was a baby's hand. And it completely warped time perception or something. So I figured that was interesting, so I made a mental note of it. And we went back home, back to his house, and I was playing around with that pin of light in the kitchen, and I found out that I could compress it more, and it would get these solid, flat, planar surfaces on it. And it was an octahedron, 8-sided out of 4 or equilateral triangles. And I later found out that a modified version of the octahedron is what can be described as the perfect shape. It has the most area and the least surface area, or most volume, least surface area, for any shape that can be patterned infinitely in 3-dimensional space without leaving any gaps. This is magic perfect shape. And I ate it. I ate the pin of light. And it's been with me basically since then.
That's crazy. And do you, what did eating it change inside you?
It wasn't immediately noticeable at first, but eventually I realized that was the need or the ultimate drive, the passion to pursue the path of psychedelics to the intensities that I did. Because after that trip, every single weekend for the next year and a half, I dosed about 200 to 400 micrograms of LSD.
Wow.
And at the end of it, in the last 2 months, I did breaks every other weekend and started ramping up the dose 500, 600, capped at 1,000 at the very end of it. And that was with a clean tolerance, and that was a torturous trip, an absolutely hellish trip, and I wouldn't wish that on anyone, no matter how terrible they were. It was just excruciatingly torturous. But after that, I ended up in the hospital on 3 separate occasions from that last trip. And I had severe HPPD for about 3 months until I got put on antipsychotics that were doing the job right. And HPPD is a hallucinogenic persisting perception disorder. It's kind of like when some trip effects persist after the drug is worn off.
Yeah.
And this was at like 100 microgram dose for 3 months, sober. And it made life absolutely impossible to function in. I couldn't do anything, not reasonably. Somehow I kept a job and survived, but it was really my dad that kept me through all of it, and that's why he doesn't like the path that I'm on as much as I'd prefer he did.
Yeah.